Welcome to Truflation Spaces for Wednesday, January 31st, 2024. It is our FOMC kind of ahead of their second day in DC in the Eccles building, where they're set to basically tell us what the plan is this afternoon, whether they're going to raise, hold, or lower rates. Our objective this morning and throughout the spaces for the next hour is to try to give you some insight on what exactly they might be doing um, and why they might be doing it. We've got a great guest, special honored guest today for the panel, and that's Michael W. Green of Simplified Asset Management. He'll be on to break everything down for us. Um, Kind of vamping at the moment, waiting to get our speakers in, get them to um, get in here as fast as humanly possible. Um, it is sponsored. Today's Spaces is sponsored by Truflation Premium. So if you've got a chance, get out to truflation.com. Look at the, let's see here. Mike, if you could mute yourself real quick. Let's see.
Unfortunately, it's not letting me mute myself. I'm not quite sure what's going on with the controls here. I'm going to sign out and come right back in, okay?
It's all good. Um, yeah, so we're still getting people in here. Sorry about that, guys. I'm usually a little bit smoother, but just not happening this morning. Let's see. Okay. Again, we are sponsored by Truflation Spaces. Sorry, Truflation Premium. Let's start that again. And it is our granular look at data. You can subscribe at various levels. It's meant for businesses, the investor. It's really something you shouldn't walk a block without. The idea being, of course, that we're way ahead of the curve, and we usually are. So get out to truflation.com and choose the plan that's right for you. It looks like we've got most of our panel today assembled. And again, this is our FOMC special edition for Truflation Spaces. It is a CPI that we have sub to just a hair below 2%, which of course is the traditional Fed target. Looks like we're at 1.97 this morning. So that's something to talk about. And we have been since I believe about the 20th of January. We have it as being below 2%. So, is the Fed watching? Do they kind of side eye us? Are they watching? Are they paying attention? We know that some of their metrics, their internal metrics, agree with us. And well, we'll see. We'll see what their reaction is today. But more importantly, we have a very honored guest in Michael W. Green of Simplify Asset Management. He's the chief strategist out there. We also have Yosef Chantal, investor and entrepreneur as well. But before we get to them, let's turn to our CEO and founder, Stefan Rust, for a quick state of the Truflation Nation. Hey, Stefan, what's the latest from the Truflation camp?
Well, thank you. Thank you for always putting on a great spaces, and thank you, Michael, for joining us here. I mean, it's economically, everything is, unemployment rates are staying at all-time lows. The economy seems to remain very strong. The numbers are coming in strong. And so, that's all playing good. I think from Truflation standpoint, the true CPI really fell below 2%. So real inflation over a year ago, based on the 18 million items that we track and the 3 price feeds that we take in per item, in the 12 categories that we aggregate on a daily basis, are really showing that it's coming down and to the 1.76%. Will it stay there? I think that's the big question. especially given these numbers and given that we have an election year this year. I think this year it's super exciting because if you think about it, not only does the US have elections, you have 7 out of the 10 world's most populous nations are going to the polls this year. And so, what does that mean, and how does that impact global liquidity? At the same time, on a global basis, we're standing at about $90 trillion in debt worldwide. And when will responsible actors come in and sort of help fix that? And that's why we need impartial aggregation of economic and financial data like Truflation. And we need to sort of really take a look at this at a global level, right? We're seeing China go into a tailspin and trying to fix their economy over there. And they've been printing a lot more money. What's that going to mean to the global supply of money? And that liquidity, how's that going to impact inflation? So all exciting stuff. It's not all doom and gloom. I think, we have a lot of sort of technologies that are out there that can really drive down the product cost and increase productivity. And I think that's really where we need to find the right tools and systems to encourage entrepreneurship in areas, like AI, like blockchain, like clean tech, like biotech, etc. And how do we build frameworks that encourage that? Entrepreneurship's a tough game anyway, let alone, if you put in all the hurdles that government puts in currently with a lot of the needs for the requirements for listings, filings, approvals, licenses, submissions, etc. And so if we can streamline that process, simplify that, we will create lots of new jobs, we will create lots of new wealth, and ultimately generate tax income to start servicing that $91 trillion. So that's what we're here trying to do, and glad to be on this panel.
Yeah, yeah. Let's turn now to the Truflation head of data, Ivan Yelik, for a little bit of insight as to the numbers we're seeing right now. The CPI today jumped to 192 of 1.92, still below the Fed target rate. But Ivan, you sort of, well, not you sort of, you definitely explained what the jump was, but just in case people, or the cause of it, what was the reason for it jumping up so quickly in one day?
Hi, and thank you for hosting this spaces again, and thank you for the question. So definitely there's been a movement in Truflation numbers, and I believe it will continue in the following days. But the one that happened from yesterday to today was due to the fact that we had a new data coming from a data provider that is actually representing the prices of the rent. So since housing is having a really big weight overall on the inflation numbers, the impact on the overall number is 0.2 or 0.21% upwards. And as you said, it's still staying below 2%. And overall, we can see that most of the drops that we see in the year-over-year numbers are just coming from the fact that last year we still had more increases than we do now. So the only thing that it's showing is basically that we are having price increases, but on a slower rate. In no case we see any price drops, which would be showing that the price levels are lower than the last year. So we still have a growth of prices, the increase, but it's on a slightly slower rate than last year.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive as if you're just part of the hoi polloi, just a layperson looking at the numbers. You go, oh, it's going down, but it's a slow in the rate of increase. It's always a difficult bit of jujitsu we have to do to explain that. But to analyze what's happening and ahead of today's FOMC presser with Jay Powell, the chair there, to let us know what the Fed will do today. We have, of course, our head of product, our main analyst, who's always on and really at demand, in demand rather, all the time. He's all over podcasts and news outlets and so on for commentary and analyzation rather. And that, of course, is Oliver Roost. Oliver, what do you think is going to happen today? What's your take on what the Fed might do?
Thanks again for having me. And good to be on this exciting panel and to be at the first FMOC meeting of 2024. It's exciting
Oh,
times.
that's right. That's right.
So I think today's, well, not a foregone conclusion, but the assumption is it is a foregone conclusion that there's going to be no hike in interest rates or changes in the interest rates, either up or down. I think the belief is that we're at the terminal rate and we are all debating about when and by how much does the Fed start reducing the interest rates. And I think a lot of the market is already baking in the first reductions coming in March. Whereas I think some economists and the FOMC, if you look at the last dot plot, would suggest that they are thinking differently to what the market is. And I think if you look at the data set that's out there, normally the Fed will reduce the rates to kickstart the economy if it's in a recession or to keep it going. But clearly that's not the case, right? The GDP numbers came out for Q4 last week, and they came in at 3.3, well above the 2% estimate. So it seems to be have a raring economy continuing. We have a tight labor market. Stefan spoke a bit about the unemployment situation. We haven't had a single monthly decline in unemployment numbers since 2020. So either people are having a really strong job and the economy is raring to go, or people are moving from job to job. It's probably a combination of the two to make ends meet, but certainly suggests a very tight labor market that we're in. Spending is continuing to rise, right? We saw the December spending numbers up another $150 billion. And, the consumer confidence came out for January, and we're at the strongest surge that we've seen since Truflation started measuring consumer confidence about 18 months ago, and we're at a really high rate. So the surge in consumer confidence is significant. And I think the final thing I'd say is that just the core inflation, right? Ivan spoke about the headline inflation, but I think, from a Fed perspective, they really look at core, and core has been really sticky. It's been holding, or at least at the CPI level, it's been holding at that 3.9% for the last 4 months. So, I think it's a delicate balance. I think it's difficult to predict some of the macroeconomic factors that are coming into play, the geopolitical markets coming into play. That makes it a bit more complicated. And I think there is, a question mark of when that were coming. But I think with the markets expecting the first cuts to come in March, I think Truflation is of the viewpoint, and I'm certainly of the viewpoint, it's contrarian to that. I don't believe that that the interest rates will come down in March. The first one, I think the cost of, if you look at just the mortgage rates and the increase in mortgage rates, and then you compare that against delinquency rates have been dropping, right? They haven't been increasing despite these higher costs of borrowing. Consumer debt and spending is still going crazy. And that there's huge consumer confidence, increases in wages. It's all accelerating the GDP growth, and that seems no way of stopping. So I think, what's the urgency, given this whole economic growth, what's the urgency for the FOMC to bring inflation down? Their focus will be stay on course to make sure the job is done. And I personally doubt they'll tip their hand as to when to expect a cut. So I think the economy is too strong to expect any cuts anytime soon. I would expect the first cut to happen sometime, probably in either the May or June meeting. And that's it from my side.
Yeah. And you think during an election year too, that they probably don't want to upset the apple cart too much, which brings us to our guest of honor today. It's Michael W. Green. He is chief strategist, of course, out at Simplify Asset Management. Super insightful guy, known for his keen analysis, and we're just super excited to have him on today. Hey, Michael, thanks again for coming on. And what's your general feeling at this point?
Well, I have to confess, my initial feeling is I've never heard my middle initial used so frequently in an introduction. So
Oh, you also you know that
stands
I
for
do you know that
W
there's
stands
another.
for what a jerk. But thank you very much for having me. I'm a huge fan of Truflation, and have been highlighting the work that you guys have done, even from the point that you originated. I love the backstory, by the way, that you guys originated in the 2021 time period in an environment in which everyone was convinced that the BLS was underreporting inflation, and in particular, emphasis on things like owner's equivalent rent and saying, isn't this ridiculous? Rent numbers are up 15, 20%, and the BLS is saying that they're really low. Today, of course, you guys are on the other end of the spectrum with everybody wanting to completely dismiss the fact that maybe we're actually closer to target than we should be. It feels like that has broken in the past couple of weeks, but even just going back a couple of months ago, it's like nobody really wanted to believe any of this stuff. Um, so I would kind of put myself into the camp of saying like, look, at the end of the day, if I look back on 2023, I think your analysis that suggests that inflation was somewhere in the 2% range to finish the year feels about right, and that the Fed should be cutting on the basis of elevated levels of real interest rates. And I would push back a little bit on your analysis that delinquency rates aren't rising, et cetera. Actually, look at New York Community Bank Corp today. Expected credit losses of 45 million, coming in at 550 million. That's a reasonable miss by any measure. Likewise, credit card delinquency rates are now above pre-pandemic levels, rising faster than even the period of 2006 to 2008. What we haven't had yet is the actual official equivalent of the confirmation of the recession, the surge in unemployment, and the strong deterioration of credit metrics that accompanies the sizable job loss. But I got to tell you, my gut tells me it's here. I also have to ask you guys a couple of quick questions since I have you on the horn. If I look at, I posted, for example, the aggregated inflation number, the cumulative inflation numbers that you guys have. And if I look at that, at least on its surface, it would suggest that we've actually been in a deflationary condition on your metrics for the past several months. Is that accurate? Is that the way you guys are seeing the world?
That's for anybody on the panel, by the way, who wants to take it.
Sorry, Michael, for the late response. Just trying to get off mute.
No, that's fine.
No, the reduction in the rates, the cooling, shall we say, of the rate of increase on the aggregated number is that we're basing everything back to 2020 or 2021. I can't remember the exact date. And then given the cooling of inflation number comparatively to that, it has been coming down a bit. Yes. Because it's slowing down. The rate of increase is slowing down, and therefore the aggregated number is coming down because the number was a lot higher earlier this year or earlier last year. Sorry.
Well, wait, so just to be clear though, so when you're saying aggregated, I think of that as a cumulative change in the price level, right? So the aggregate price level as compared to the inflation rate. Am I interpreting that correctly in what I'm looking at here, that this is the equivalent of the CPI level as compared, or GDP deflator, to put it in more accurate terms? And I do think, by the way, I actually want to emphasize something. One of the differences, you guys weight your metrics differently than CPI. There are competing products out there like Price Stats, which grew out of the Billion Price Project from MIT. Roberto Rigobon and his PhD candidate, his PhD student, whose name escapes me for right now. But they have actually tried to match CPI data, right? They've tried to predict CPI for a trading purpose. You basically have constructed a purchasing basket that is much more closely aligned to, say, the PCE basket, the personal consumption expenditures basket. and you're simply reporting the data as you see it. You're not attempting to match a release or create a CPI type of basket for inflation break-evens or anything else yet at this point. Just to clarify that, right?
So So to answer your question, yes, the overarching comment is correct. Although our clients do ask us to match all our
Yep.
data back into bespoke categorizations of bespoke weightings that match up with the BLS or the PCE weighting categories, right? And so, for example, the PCE weighting categories are got a combination of the national accounts as well as the CPI shelter metric. So some of our clients do ask us to bunch up all our data back into those metrics for
Yep.
forecasting capability, but that's a bespoke requirement for each of our clients.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about that in the past, and I think that's actually
Yeah.
really critical is for people to understand that there are traded products like inflation swaps for which it can become very, very valuable to effectively predict the level of inflation. This is, as you're presenting at least, much more an information mechanism than anything else. And so it's very valuable for people to see this, but there's an incredibly high degree of skepticism around this idea that the price level could actually have been retreating for the past several months, that the Fed is probably well past its target level if we look at a prospective sort of number. And the dynamics of the other thing that I think is actually really interesting, a couple of people have come to me and criticized, for example, that you were at 175 or whatever it was, 176, and now you're at, give or take 199. Um, we all forget that everything gets revised, right? So when new data comes in, you have a choice. You can either change the data to reflect the information that has come in, or you could, dig your heels into the sand and say, I'm not going to, this is what it was. It's simply not accurate. So like overall, I think what you guys are doing is absolutely fantastic. I think it's really interesting to see. And now to your question about like what comes next, man, it's really hard for me to believe outside of a significant disruption, and I mean significantly greater than what we're seeing in the Red Sea, for example, a situation in which inflation takes off under these current conditions, right? I mean, China is desperately struggling to find buyers for their surplus production. The world in total's population is barely growing. That means all the productivity gains effectively go towards lowering cost as compared to increasing supply. And I've shared charts in the past that highlight how unique and different the 20th century was in its inflationary characteristics. And so it's just, I think what you guys are doing is really important and really powerful for people to understand that the Fed the BLS is now reporting data that appears to be behind the curve in the same way that it was behind the curve in 2021, just from the top as compared to the bottom. And that policymakers, are scarred by that experience and probably unlikely to respond in a timely manner.
You're listening to Truflation Spaces, special FOMC edition, as we await Jay Powell's presser this afternoon, I believe around 2 p.m. Eastern. We have special guest Michael Green, chief strategist out at Simplify Asset Management. Michael, if memory serves, I think last year you were predicting or maybe forecasting a recession. I know that the typical, I think the administration or someone in the court macro sphere there was rejiggering what constituted a recession. But barring that, did I get that right? You were thinking that we were headed into recession. Do you still feel that way? If I got this right, and do you see that as something looming this quarter or this year?
So I'll tell you, I actually think that we are in recession. Again, I think data gets revised. I am very cognizant of the risk that I am now the one digging in my heels to say that this appears to be the case. But we are seeing very much this pattern of rising delinquencies. We are seeing a pattern of rising unemployment, particularly amongst the lower skill components. I would argue on a state type basis, right? If I look around the country, some states, California, for example, is very clearly in recession. And in an environment in which the majority of the jobs are now actually coming from the government sector, we really are just basically one or two events away from being able to say somewhat definitively that things are worse than we think. The layoffs are beginning to mount. We've seen over 100,000 layoffs announced already this month. As I mentioned, delinquency rates are rising. The severity of loan loss is increasing. On an international basis or on a global basis, we're seeing tremendous weakness across Europe and Asia. And the problem I think that people are really struggling with is how do I match that narrative of a recession with markets at all-time highs? Unfortunately, I think the answer is tied to other work that I do, which is that when you have an environment in which the vast majority of the flows, actually far more than 100% of the marginal flows, are going into things like passive vehicles, that you should expect to see prices inflated until the flows shift in the opposite direction. There's just not, there's not the thoughtful analysis associated with the information that we're receiving that would allow people to critically evaluate what does it mean to have the world's largest companies trading at well above 30 times earnings. Is that even remotely sustainable in terms of expectations or future cash flow delivery? And I think if you're willing to actually suspend belief that in Bitcoin terms, number go up doesn't actually tell you something about the fundamental developments, that it becomes far easier to actually turn around and say, okay, we probably are actually already in a recession.
Yeah, I get most nervous during the boom than I do the bust. It just seems somewhat irrational. And when your previous comment about China was kind of interesting too. I saw somewhere, and I just read the headline. I confess to not reading the actual article. Said that China now is outpacing the U.S. in terms of money printing. So that's something to watch. We do want your questions and comments, listeners. So if you want to get in here, do that. We also are honored to have a guest with us. It's the investor and entrepreneur Yosef Shaftal out at dvdt.cc. Hey, Yosef, thanks for coming back on, man.
Hey, how's it going, guys? I actually have a question for Oliver and Ivan, probably. There was a very big change in the CPI data from end of December. Boom, it just went down quite a bit significantly. And the question that I have for you guys is that are we going to see when the CPI numbers are going to be announced in January, right? Are we going to see basically a massive drawdown in the inflation that the Fed is going to be publishing? And that's just the biggest trick, because right now, officially, the CPI inflation is definitely higher than what was expected, right? But then there was this switch that was a 1% movement or something like that I remember seeing, in terms of drop. Are we going to see this reflected in January, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the expectation is that the BLS, we'll come to a final conclusion in the next couple of days. But the expectation is that the BLS reported CPI number will drop in January, and there's a number of reasons for that. But in essence, we're coming out of the post festive blues, and in January we always see the prices shift downwards. And we've seen that historically across the board. So, this time we're expecting that to be prevalent as well again. But again, we don't see that as a long-term trend either. Obviously it will come down over time gradually, but I don't see it coming down then going down further. I think we see even a surge happening.
With my my Twitter, because I couldn't hear anybody.
The rest of us can hear it.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. No, I was just wondering, do we expect a massive drop, for us, the next inflation data that's going to come for the month of January, right? In a couple of weeks from now. Do you think
Yes, short answer is, Joseph, the short answer is yes.
because there was a very big switch in numbers, like from December to
Yeah, he
January
somehow
on
can't hear you.
Truflation, and it usually takes a
Yeah.
month for it to
Okay.
reflect on the BLS numbers.
Yeah,
Yosef,
Oliver's answer is the short
yeah.
answer is yes.
Yosef, I'm not sure if you can hear them.
I don't think he can hear any of
Yes, I
us.
Yeah.
hear now. So sorry
You,
about
Oh.
that, guys.
all right. So you can hear me. The answer from Oliver and Stefan was yes. They think that is going to show up in the February release of data.
Perfecto. So we'll be excited. So do you guys think that, like, because and this is a question for Michael, I guess, like, when the number is going to be drastically lower, and it's going to be a percentage-wise, we probably are expecting something like a 33% change, in terms of numbers. Do you think that there would be something that, FOMC meeting that's going to come afterwards? Do you think they're going to say that, listen, we defeated the inflation and Yahoo? Or are they going to say, are they going to take more of like a stable approach, and like usually like how many months they need to see of stability of below 2% for them to say, hallelujah, we defeated the inflation enemy?
So since you can't hear the others, I'll at least attempt to answer that. One, there is no set component, right? So individuals like Claudia Sahm, who's a former Fed economist, known for the Sahm rule, the indication of a recession in quote unquote real time is measured by a 50 basis point increase in the unemployment rate. She's indicating that she thinks they should be cutting immediately, that they should be cutting at this meeting. Others, would say, why in the world would the Fed cut with risk assets near all-time highs, credit spreads near lows? And I tend to lean towards the market interpretation. I think that Jay Powell is more, one, he's going to have cover from the lagging dynamics associated with things like owner's equivalent rent, as well as some of the lagged impact of things like insurance and others that are tied to asset prices, as well as dynamics around increased consolidation and increased market power from many businesses. Those are going to provide some cover that allow the Fed to say, we don't see deflation as the key risk. I just don't think these are particularly creative individuals in their interpretation of data, right? It's just too risky, right? Why would you do it? You can always say, we saw fighting inflation as the biggest issue, and how are we possibly to know that China's financial system was in the process of collapsing and that dragged the economy into a recession, right? Or that the election of Donald Trump, there's too many ways to protect yourself on the outside, and it seems like I would guess that their bias is going to be wait rather than try to respond aggressively. I think, but by the way, I wrote about this morning in the tier one stuff that I put out. I think Greenspan might have tried something differently, right? Greenspan liked to fiddle and he liked to play around. The maestro, might have tried to engineer the soft landing with a little bit more finesse. I'm not convinced that that's going to be the case here.
Fascinating. Greenspan was no Volcker,
Thank
but you're
God.
saying, but you're saying Powell is no Greenspan, right? Is that kind of what I heard?
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? I think Powell, rightly or wrongly, perceives himself as having been overly influenced by markets and narrative now, both in his 2018 to 2019 cutting cycle, and in his delay in hiking in 2021. And we talked about this a lot last year, that his reaction function. There's first of all, I'm not inside the man's head, so I have to confess, like, this is speculation. But certainly, what I heard from the Washington circuit was that it became, this is a consummate politician. He has been in the political theater his entire life. He is an extraordinary individual at navigating that. You do not become, chair of the Fed by being an idiot in terms of navigating the political challenges of Washington, D.C. much less, a Fed chair that gets to serve under multiple administrations and do so, relatively well respected, um, without being really, really smart in that framework. And my understanding was that the, cocktail party chat basically became, it was, Jerome's fault, and he was being blamed for the inflation that was damaging both the Biden administration as well as, the perception of U.S. consumer confidence, and that he decided he wanted to be popular like Volcker. Now, I think that's a misunderstanding of Volcker. I alluded to, thank God he's not Volcker. I've written on this pretty extensively that I think Volcker was possibly the worst Fed chair we ever had. And I find it completely ironic that people lionize him. But I don't think that he's going to be as strong as Volcker, and I don't think he's going to be as nimble as Greenspan.
And we skipped right over Bernanke and Yellen. Bernanke was an academic, right? I know he published.
Also,
Go ahead.
very talented politician, though, right? And
Mm,
I would just say more than anything else that, my understanding of Bernanke, I actually have not met Bernanke. He's one of the few I have not met.
mm,
Uh, but my understanding of Bernanke is that it was largely, an academic exercise that, and you saw this, I think, an element of this when he was on the stage with Powell. Like he just doesn't think of Powell as his intellectual equal.
mm,
It's not clear he thinks of anyone as his intellectual equal.
mm.
Just a
But
quick question, Michael, maybe to you also. You've been traveling throughout the US and staying in different cities. And just out of curiosity, what's your view? We're in an election year this year, right? What's your view in terms of how generally we see a lot of stimulus come into the market in an election year, right? And that can be in the form of money printer, in the form of incentives, in form of new acts coming out to subsidize infrastructure or working or projects, etc. And then you have interest rate reduction to stimulate and provide better bank loans. The government, Yellen just announced BTFT to come down, BTFP, sorry. And what's your view in terms of where the economy is going to go this year and what sort of the government's tools are going to be in their arsenal that they will start trying to deploy to ensure that there's no inflation this year, that the economy is continuing to grow? Yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, your accuracy may suffer if you want to listen to me on it. As we indicated last year, I have to confess that I just disagree with the data that's been presented, and I have the patience to acknowledge that it could very well change substantively. People tend to forget that, the fourth quarter of 2007, the expectations were that GDP growth was somewhere in the neighborhood of 4%. It ended up being strongly negative.
Right.
So, the revisions to data can get really crazy as you head into a recession. With that said, like, it doesn't really matter. What I care about is the behavior of financial markets. And on that front, like, man, it sure doesn't look like a recession. So let's be really clear on that. Um, the, I think people have to be somewhat careful in terms of thinking about the behavior of stimulus in an environment in which you have a hotly contested election and a divided government. I do think that there is a strong element of this Congress has largely abdicated any form of responsibility to think thoughtfully about how to deploy capital. Everything ranging from suspending the debt ceiling to now consideration for yet more tax cuts under the Wyden bill that just seem really, really inappropriate. We have a structural financial problem. Part of it is created by Jerome Powell's interest rate policy. Part of it is created by the natural and expected aging of the baby boomers into retirement. We have this pig in the python dynamic that we've heard about and have known about for decades about the entitlements of the baby boomers and the inability to service them. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we're here, but we are. And now it's kind of too late to have any serious conversations about what do we do about it. I think, unfortunately, that the headlines around this are going to lead to probably less stimulus than people think. And I do think one of the more interesting angles on this is the arguments that come from Warren Mosler, of the MMT school, who basically highlights, look, the huge increase in deficit actually supports private sector savings and consumption. You can think of it very simply, right? Imagine everybody was a soldier and the US government was paying a lot of money to soldiers. Guess what? There'd be a lot of income out there for people to spend and save. It would likely lose value in inflationary terms, but it would still be there for people to service existing debts, et cetera. I think the problem this time is because that is flowing effectively to people, in order to benefit from the much higher interest rates, you have to have money in the bank. I actually tweeted a piece from Credit Karma that was just astonishing in its narrative, looking at households, looking at individuals, and the financial distress that people are increasingly finding themselves in, and the nihilism around the behavior in that. I think Stephen and Oliver, you guys are roughly the same age I am, which is basically Paleolithic dirt. And it just is shocking to me to see people confronted with financial distress decide to, well, let's just buy one more, Birkin
Yeah.
bag. Um, I don't understand it, but I mean, I guess I kind of do, but man, when you shut that off and go cold turkey, that's a really ugly picture. And it does seem like, Peter Atwater has also talked about this extensively, this idea of the K-shaped economy. The bottom 50% are really, really struggling and getting relief, particularly because increasingly their jobs, the labor tightness that we were experiencing at that level is being pressured by immigration. I think that in turn is influencing the political discourse, where you're seeing the Republicans in particular emphasize immigration and what historically would have been called nativism, um, as basically a policy, right? Let's just keep everybody out. Let's run America for Americans. And while those are, I think, very valid concerns, they have large economic implications in terms of the costs of doing business, the behavior of U.S. in the rest of the world, et cetera. It's the combination of that nihilism, um, and the nativism has a lot of echoes of the 1920s in it.
Fascinating. And you are listening to Truflation Spaces with special guest Michael Green, Chief Strategist of Simplify Asset Management. We do want your questions, comments, concerns. We'll put you right up here as soon as you request to speak. It should be in the app, very convenient to find there. We'd like to hear what you have to say. You've got an expert panel here ready to go. Along with Michael Green, we have Yosef Chantal of dvdt.cc. So everybody's here. Do ask your questions. Um, Michael, you were talking about immigration, which obviously politics is not something we touch, but it is an issue, right? Depending on the estimates I've seen, it's a couple million people at least have come in the country since the Biden administration began. Does that? I know this is kind of an old trope, but would a phenomenon like that undermine those 50% you're talking about? Because I guess theoretically they don't become doctors and lawyers right away. They're going to they're going to assume jobs that are presumably of that lower 50% service sector and so on. Does that undermine? You know, well, I think you get my gist.
Yeah, I think I do. You're saying effectively, does the immigration undermine the economic prospects of the bottom half of the labor force? Is that what you're highlighting? Is that the core of the question?
Yeah, exactly. Because I don't have to worry about my job, right? Like I'm, you know,
Well, I've been meaning to talk to you about that actually, but
no one would blame you. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. That revision to the data, taking it back closer to 2%, like, yeah, we really need to talk. But no, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think we're seeing this. If you look at the unemployment rates for the least skilled members of our society, those with less than a high school degree or less than a college degree, they're rising quite sharply. Minority populations, like the Black community, has seen a substantive deterioration in their unemployment rate. These tend to be the groups that are most susceptible to replacement by new immigrants. Um, and the evidence is growing rapidly that that appears to be the case.
Yeah, the tensions in places like Chicago and New York are palpable
It's
on
it,
that
it
score.
New York and Chicago, as you mentioned, the tensions are like it's astonishing. Like when you think about the stress that New York City is struggling with as a city that has opened its arms to immigrants
Right.
and
Sure.
is housing them in hotels, etc.
Yeah.
It's the school system is suffering under an influx of children
Hmm.
that they are unprepared for, which is of course ironic because New York City has been hemorrhaging children, and so theoretically this is like a boon to the New York City system, except that these individuals don't meaningfully contribute, at least at this stage, to the economic vitality of the city. And so it's just pure stress, at least on the initial wave. Um, yeah, there's just a lot of stress that's being created by it. And, you know, those who are uh, more economically robust tend to treat immigration as an unalloyed good because, as you point out, your job is not at risk. Based on my performance last year, mine probably should be, but the simple reality is that we're just not competing with those individuals, and instead those individuals offer us relief in terms of household help or people to drive cars for us or do whatever, and so we don't feel it in the same way.
Yeah, and that's without taking any kind of politics into consideration. Stefan really already asked about the election season, and you definitely navigated that with regard to the legislative branch. But let's, if you don't mind, let's touch the other third rail here. I'm not sure if that works in my analogy, but that would be El Trump, the orange god of thunder. What what do you make of a possible? I personally don't think he's going to get anywhere near the White House. This is without me taking a side either way, just in terms of prognostications. But what do you think a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, would mean to the macro outlook? As because I think Biden administration, it's sort of a known quantity, right? We're going to get more. More investment in the public sector, probably a more robust unionized sector. These are all stereotypes that I'm carrying around. But what do you think a Trump administration would mean? Second Trump administration mean on as far as macro economy?
Well, I mean, I actually think it's quite interesting in the Biden administration, just to address that very quickly. While I do think that the use of the phrase "more," right, maybe more accurately spelled MOAR, um, somewhat accurately describes the solution set for this administration, right? Let's try to spend more money. Let's try to offer more benefits. Let's try to do more from the state side of the equation, even as they actually, I think, are making some really positive steps in trying to force less of some things. So, for example, less consolidation, less monopolies, a recognition of the costs that we are increasingly bearing from the failure to enforce antitrust has contributed to the inflationary conditions that we've experienced. Anyone who actually follows the economics of this understands that what's disparagingly called the greedflation is actually a very real phenomenon where corporations have had the market power to push through price increases, generating record levels of profitability for the larger companies. in a period in which, at least historically, inflation has represented lower profitability for most corporations. That's not happening this time. It's being pushed directly on the consumer because the market power exists. Um, so I think there's some positives associated with this administration, but I also think that, as you correctly point out, like it does very much feel like the answer to every question is, well, let's get somebody in from the government to help here, and that tends to be a pretty bad outcome. One of the reasons I love entities like Truflation is, if I understand your budget is significantly less than I think the $40 billion a year that are spent by the BLS to produce the equivalent of CPI and other data that's increasingly of low quality. I might be wrong on that, but if you guys are indeed actually spending $40 billion a year, congratulations.
I
So like,
wish.
yeah, I know. Wouldn't it be awesome? It would be awesome, but it's not true. And so like we do need to actually recognize that we are facing a really unique opportunity for a fundamental rethink of government. There's been actually some really fascinating work that has been done, including what you guys are doing, to try to replicate a lot of the administrative state at low cost with higher trust levels. And I think that's a really positive outcome. I also, as I was indicating at the very start, like I think sometimes people just don't want to believe numbers, period, right? So you guys are going to face the same skepticism that the BLS faces in a lot of ways, because it conflicts with what people see with their individual eyes, right, or what they reference on. Um, but like I'll just give some simple examples. There's a couple of academics that have done work using large language models. We colloquially refer to as AI now. They have deployed those against housing regulations on a nationwide basis, actually having the computers read the billions of pages of housing regulations that are created in every municipality and attempt to break them down into like, okay, how should this actually affect things? What does the actual language mean here? What are the implications of it? And the accuracy rates that they're getting in terms of an expert review versus an LLM review is in the neighborhood of 85%, and that's going to climb very rapidly. Um, that opens up the possibility for us to actually take that giant tax code and take those giant regulations and say, like, what the hell are we actually trying to do here? Because we've basically got spaghetti code that's no different than the nonsense of COBOL programmers, leading into the year 2000 sort of thing. So it's a really interesting time in history where I think that there's the opportunity for a fundamental rethink around a lot of this stuff. Now, I didn't even begin to address Trump there because I think,
Right.
unfortunately for me, like what Trump really represents is actually a step backwards. Um, from a political standpoint, I just want to be very clear. I actually voted for Trump. I voted for Trump because I was a single issue voter around China. I'm pleased that the Biden administration has at least continued to place some pressure on China. I think it's fundamentally a flawed and very dangerous relationship that we've entered into with them. I think we need to figure out ways to sever it, or at least continue to move down that path. And ironically, I actually think Trump is less likely to do that. I think in this administration, Trump would be all about cutting deals that allow him to benefit himself. And, I'm just seeing no real evidence that he has America's best interest at heart. We see that with the immigration debate, for example, right now. He's far more frightening to me in his second administration than he is in the first. With that said, I actually have a somewhat, it was contrarian when I floated it a year ago, and I think it's a little bit less contrarian today. But as crazy as it sounds, I think there's a reasonable chance that neither of the two leading candidates are the ones that are competing for office. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's a high probability that Biden actually steps down at the convention and is replaced with Gavin Newsom. We had Gavin basically floated as a public representative traveling to China. He did an amazing job. I know people. By the way, I just want to be very clear. I am not a Gavin Newsom fan. I detest the guy.
Yeah.
But he really did actually quite a remarkable job of defending his track record and speaking eloquently in a way that almost no current politician is capable of doing. And I wouldn't be the least, he did exactly what you would expect him to do. Step forward, made an impression, and then went quietly so that he's not actually competing with Biden, right? Most people are dismissing that. I think it's incredibly easy for him to step in the convention as a replacement for Biden to attempt to re-energize the Democrats. And can you imagine Trump trying to debate Gavin Newsom? Like
Yeah,
that would be a crazy. Trump would is way out of his league in that.
I would love to see it though. Newsom has certainly been everywhere. So, Stefan, you wanted to ask?
Yeah, no, just and what's your thoughts on instead of Newsom coming in, having Blinken step in? He's been
I
up
think,
at the West, he's been sort of
yeah.
hanging out with those elitists, and I don't know. I mean, that's another
I think
theory
it's a
I have,
harder
at
one.
least.
I think it's a harder
Yeah.
one, but again, like I would lump them all in the same category. This is not something that we have seen in our generation,
Yeah.
but it used to happen all the time,
Yep. Yeah.
All right.
right?
Go
So
ahead.
no, that was
Well,
it. That's
go ahead.
nothing more insightful to say.
In the last 5 minutes here, let me get your perspective because you triggered me on China. Um, Argentina has really gone against the grain and elected my personal hero, Javier Milei. Um, he has taken a hard line on China. Any back of the envelope, quick hot takes on Milei?
Um, if I'm being totally honest with you, like I just think he's irrelevant. Um, is it an interesting experiment? Experiment? Is it like Pinochet in Chile, and bringing in the technocrats and attempting to, modernize things and create a libertarian state? Sure, right? And Bukele is, modernizing the economic system of El Salvador. Woohoo! I just don't think it's like on the world stage. I think he's getting far more press than is actually relevant. Maybe it's the start of something, but I'll reserve judgment until I actually see it play out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yosef, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I actually have a question for Michael. We just got the news that New York Bancorp just crashed like crazy, right?
Yep.
And just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And we thought that the banking danger was over with, right? Because like it feels like the minute the Fed removed the the liquidity bridge that they set up, looks like there some bad things are happening. So just want to know about your overall thoughts on the banking sector and what to expect moving forward with that.
Well, unfortunately, like I've never thought that the banking crisis was over per se. I think that what they did was they lowered the banking margins significantly by making available funds to replace deposits at competitive rates, right? Effectively zero margin rates. That allows you to kick the can down the road, and the hope would have been that there would have been a much more positive resolution. There was also an extension of the deposit guarantee to all deposits, which candidly I thought was insane, but necessary in the context of what we were experiencing. It's we can all sit around debating whether it was the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do. It is somewhat absurd that very large depositors like corporations or Silicon Valley VCs should not be expected to do credit analysis on their own banks. That just, like it just seems pretty stupid to me. But that's the world that we created for ourselves, so we're going to have to deal with it for at least a period of time. Now, of course, you're seeing the commercial real estate. The losses at New York Bancorp appear primarily to have been tied to losses on a couple of large loans in the commercial real estate space. I just don't see any way to avoid that getting bigger, right? And so we've known that this was operating in the background. We've known that these losses exist. We've known that community banks or smaller banks are over-indexed into the commercial real estate space. And we've also known that the losses were somewhat inevitable within that space. I think, the confusing part in many ways is how anyone thought that the actual banking crisis was actually over.
Interesting.
But do you think that because those are the banks that are Jerome Powell's I don't want to call them a backbone because they're not big four, but still they're piggy bank, let's call it. How fast do you think, how much pressure is this putting on the all these collapses and like is having on the Fed to basically say F it and just lower the rates even at a sooner rate just to save the banking sector?
Well, I think that it does increase the probability, right? Like you got to be very, very clear on that. To see a banking crisis and at minimum to have to consider that they are going to have to manage through something that they had kind of hoped that they weren't going to have to manage through. They do have to think about that and respond to it. I think the ease with which they seem to have navigated Silicon Valley Bank suggests that they're less likely to react aggressively to this. But I also think that they have, they've got, as I described it in my commentary today, they've got a free option, right? They can come out and be hawkish, or at least modestly hawkish, and say, we're still not at target, right? Which they aren't, because of the lagging nature of some of these things, the OER in particular, and the large weight that has in the CPI. PCE, as others have pointed out, is already well below that, but nobody's actually reporting that, and so I'm not sure that they're paying attention to it in the same way. I at least am not hearing any indication they are. And they kind of have a free option right now with asset markets sitting near all-time highs to turn around and say, let's just see if the market really cares, right? And so my sense is that they're unlikely to immediately respond aggressively, but I could be wrong about that. And ultimately, I think that will end up being the dynamic.
Very nice. You've been listening to Truflation Spaces, our FOMC edition here ahead of Jay Powell's presser this afternoon with the great Michael Green of Simplify Asset Management, the chief strategist out there. He's put on a clinic for us today. Michael, before I let you go, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, first, don't forget the W. All right, it's Michael W. Green. And the easiest way to follow me is on Twitter at ProfPlum99. You can also follow my work at my Substack at yesIgiveafig.com. And you can find all of the products and thoughts, and including our own podcasts and Twitter Spaces, etc., on the Simplify website at www.simplify.us.
Very nice. And not least, of course, would be Yosef Chantal. How can people follow your work, brother?
We're the secret weapon behind many different founders, and we like to keep it that way. But more or less, Twitter is the way to go.
Boom. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening and for chiming in. We really appreciate it. And we will see you in a couple of weeks. Until then, take good care and get out to Truflation.com.
Thank you, Michael.
Oh, it's a real
And
pleasure.
thank you, Rook.
Thanks, everybody.